Hello, social studies students. How are you today? Today we're going to work on Notes 3, which is the Great Depression. So have your packet available to fill in the blanks, or if you weren't able to have a paper copy in front of you, then go ahead and open another tab so you can look at the notes that I provided on Google Classroom. So here we go. We're going to start on page 9, work through page 10 of our notes, and you might notice a roadmap page on 11, which is something we would have done in class, but you can just go ahead and cross that off. Now you will need a pencil and a highlighter, but if you don't have a highlighter, that's okay. You can always underline. And then notice the colored pencils in the corner there. They will be needed for tomorrow. So have something available. You just need 2 colors. Crayons, markers, highlighters, colored pencils, anything would work. All right, now the man you see in the lower left-hand corner is Herbert Hoover. As the Roaring Twenties were coming to an end, remember it was a very prosperous time economically for the United States, and Americans were enjoying that prosperity. He campaigned on the idea that he would just kind of continue things as they were, and Americans liked that idea, so they elected him in 1928. Look at that map. There are very few states that didn't vote for him. But as we also hinted at before spring break, during the 1920s, there were some issues that were starting to come up concerning our nation's economy that some people were taking note of, but most people were kind of ignoring. Some of the biggest were those risky practices like buying on the margin on the stock market, for example. So Republican Herbert Hoover, he ran against Alfred E. Smith in 1928. He emphasized all those years of prosperity in the 1920s under the Republican presidents. And as we said, he won by an overwhelming majority. So there's his election poster. There's another supporter. And there's that overwhelming majority of Americans who just kind of wanted to continue things on as the way they were. They didn't see any problem in the future. But they would be wrong. During World War I, Americans were encouraged to borrow money from banks to expand their farms and grow more food to help the Allied countries. Banks in the United States had loaned foreign countries money to rebuild after World War I. American industries were mass-producing goods with the idea of selling exports to other countries. Americans were buying consumer goods and cars and homes on credit so they could enjoy the luxuries of higher standards of living right now instead of waiting. And as we talked about, many Americans were also investing in the stock market. Now, in each one of those examples, there's a risk involved. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about some of those today. The biggest one, of course, is the stock market. Most people who are buying into the stock market were feeling like this newspaper headline, they were feeling invincible. Everything seemed to be going up, up, up. And remember, even people who didn't have money to invest in the stock market could borrow from the bank and invest by buying on the margin. Remember, though, that means that they still owe the bank money, even if they lose money on the stock market. So industries are growing in the 1920s. People are investing. When a company is doing well, remember, their shareholders do well too. Those who were hoping to get rich quick were going to be sorely mistaken as the stock market starts to take a dip at the end of the 1920s. In September of 1929, investors celebrated as stock prices reached a record high, but the bubble was about to burst. On Thursday, October 24th, stockbrokers were trying to sell tens of thousands of shares, but nobody was buying, and prices were starting to fall. Investors panicked as they saw the value of their stocks falling lower and lower. Stockbrokers were demanding payment from investors who had bought stocks on the margin, meaning that they wanted cash. They didn't just want a promise of a payback. And so people started to frantically try to sell their shares. By Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the stock market had collapsed, and this day becomes known as Black Tuesday, the most disastrous day in stock market history. So in your notes, let's remind ourselves that on page 9, people were irresponsibly investing in the stocks, and many lost money when it crashed on Black Tuesday. Here's a headline from October 24th, Wall Street panic as stocks crash, billions lost, wave of selling engulfs the financial market. I think that it's about 30 billion that was exchanged and lost at that time. Here's another graphic for you to look at. You can see the peak there in 1929 in terms of the stock market sales and the values of the stocks, and then that dip that you see Black Tuesday. And then you can see, looking ahead, what happens to the stock market as we move into 1930, 1931, and 32 when it hits the low. In your notes on page 9, for Black Tuesday, that nickname for October 29th, 1929, that's when the stock market crashed and marked the start of the Great Depression. Now you can take your highlighter and choose two or three phrases that you think are key to this definition. Okay, let's move on. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, which is defined from 1929 to 1940, where our economy plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed. Not only were Americans using bank loans to buy stock, but even more Americans were buying consumer goods like homes and cars on credit. Banks were loaning people money with the understanding that they would make a profit from the interest they charged. Banks had also loaned foreign countries money after World War I. So when the stock market bottoms out, people begin to panic and run to get their money out of the banks. But even banks that were doing okay at that time struggled as those people panicked and withdrew their money. Some banks ran out of money. This is a picture of a bank run, which is where Americans who were scared that they might not be able to get their money out of the bank went to their banks to try to pull it all out. But they weren't the only ones, as you can see by the crowd here. There's a good example of a bank run from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. I provided a link under the optional resources. It's only about 4 minutes. You can see kind of the panic that was involved. Now, banks were not controlled by the United States government this time, weren't very regulated. They're not controlled by the US government now, but they weren't regulated at the time. And so we'll see some changes in the banking industry develop. Now, some banks, when they ran out of money, they just plain old closed, and people who had put their money in there were out of luck. So let's go ahead and fill in under banks on page 9 that banks loaned people and nations, like Britain and France, for example, money which they could not later repay. And then we experienced those bank runs. Now, Britain and France and the world really experienced this depression as well. As a result of the stock market crash, it appears many people were not able to repay their loans to the bank. The banks may run out of money if this continues. And it did. By the late 1920s, spending had declined. People were buying less. Businesses had been mass producing consumer goods that were now starting to sit around in warehouses waiting to be sold. So, because of the high supply, prices dropped. Companies began laying off employees. And when Americans began losing jobs, people started to watch their spending even more. So this cycle continues. Fewer people buying goods means prices fall again. And that means businesses struggle and more jobs are lost. And it just spirals down. So underconsumption was a result. Remember, we are consumers when we buy things. So when people are not buying enough goods, businesses struggle to stay open. And when businesses close, remember, people lose jobs and then they buy less. And it just spirals down and down. Nope. And so as the Great Depression moves forward, people were lucky to keep a job, but it wasn't guaranteed as more and more businesses struggled with lower sales. And here's another graphic for you to look at. As things are affected in the auto industry, for example, that means textile, oil, steel, and rubber industries are impacted. And so we see industry slowing, which means people losing jobs or people being paid less, which contributes to less spending. And then the circle continues. Here's another graphic for you to kind of get the idea. By the mid-1920s, American farmers were already feeling the economic hardships. We didn't really talk about that before spring break. After World War I ended, many farmers continued to produce more, even though demands for their goods had decreased. Prices for crops began to tumble. To try and earn more income, many farmers planted even larger crops, which meant prices dropped even lower. Overproduction was a problem in urban areas as well. Companies were manufacturing goods in faster and more efficient methods, and ultimately, there were more goods than people were able to buy, so businesses had to cut jobs. So this is the overproduction result. Farms, businesses, that should say produced too much, sorry about that. Prices fell and jobs were cut. So farms and businesses produced too much. In order to protect American businesses and regain money lent to foreign countries after World War I, the U.S. government placed high tariffs on American goods sold and exported to other countries. Tariffs, remember, are those taxes on exports and imports, so anytime we trade with foreign countries. During World War I, European countries needed American-made goods. However, after World War I, most European countries couldn't afford to pay America's high tariffs, and so Europe's demand for American products dropped. So we're selling less of our products to foreign countries as well. So foreign countries could not afford the taxes to buy American products. So that means our businesses here in the United States are selling even fewer products, not only struggling to sell to Americans, but also to foreign countries. By the time the stock market stabilized in November, businesses and investors had lost more than $30 billion. This loss was greater than the amount of money the United States has spent to fight all of World War I. There's a picture you should recognize. Over time, the stock market crash impacted millions of Americans. Many banks had invested in stocks or loaned money to people who bought stocks, but after the crash, they couldn't repay the banks. So people who hadn't even participated in the stock market lost their life savings in some cases due to those risky stock market investments. There's an example of a bank run. By the early 1930s, over 80,000 businesses had failed. Many others were barely surviving. Unemployment skyrocketed, and Ford Motor Company had reduced its workforce from 128,000 to 37,000. People who had once made $40 a week were settling for $10 a week. Fewer people could afford to buy consumer goods. Factories laid off even more workers. More than 12 million workers were out of jobs, and nearly 1,000 families per day were losing their homes. Some people resorted to looking through trash to find food, and such stresses took a toll on many families. So, for the economic depression, the stock market crashed on October 1929. Banks closed when people rushed to take their money out. Businesses could not pay workers and unemployment skyrocketed, and many families lost their homes. Now, this did not happen all at once. You saw the example of the line graph that showed us that the crash happened in 1929, but over the next few years, the spiral effect took its toll. So by 1932, 1933, we are at the depths of the Great Depression, which it takes many, many years to dig out of. In fact, it takes a war to dig out of it. This is where I'm going to end our first half of Notes 3. I hope you have a wonderful day. Please email me anytime if you have questions.